Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening, and thank you all for coming. And before I dive headlong into my presentation, I'd like to thank Raj, Ravi, the McKim Business School and the Center for Emerging Markets for having me over this evening, and more importantly for having me over this fall to spend 6 months in a very vibrant community in which I've already enjoyed my various interactions with both faculty and students here at Northeastern University. Also, thank you very much to all of you for coming in despite the very inclement weather. Now, the fundamental question that I'm going to ask today is that can the Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant rise peacefully? And the second question that I'm going to sort of touch upon after I finish this part of my presentation is share some perspectives on my passion for contemporary Indian military history and why military history from an Indian perspective is an important segment of global military history. Now, I would reckon that the India-China relationship is going to emerge as one of the few defining strategic relationships of the 21st century, which is why it's important to look at this relationship through multiple prisms. I will look at it from a geographical prism, I will look at it from a geopolitical and a geo-economic prism, and I will look at it from what is bread and butter for me, which is a national security perspective. Yeah, and this is what I will discuss at the end of it all. Now, there are two divergent perspectives about the India-China relationship. One offered by one of India's iconic tech entrepreneurs, Nandan Nilekani, and the other one by a very revered American professor who has been a keen India-China watcher for over 5 decades. While Nandan Nilekani argues that in the 18th century, India and China made up 50% of the global GDP, and then both countries missed the boat as far as the Industrial Revolution was concerned. And then, sometime towards the end of the last century, both of them got onto another ship, and this ship is still steaming. And according to Nilekani, both these countries should make up 25% of the world's GDP between the period of 2010 to 2025. Now, both India and China are already there. They've crossed the figure of $25 trillion as based on their PPP terms. On the other hand, John Garver offers a far more somber perspective about India-China relations when he says that whenever China's military capabilities on India's northern frontiers and across the Indian Ocean grow steadily stronger, and whenever India moves to improve its relations with the United States, with Japan, with Australia and other democracies, Beijing issues grave warnings, and those warnings are occasionally underlined by campaigns of psychological warfare conducted via the media or incursions in remote border areas. So you will agree with me that it's a complex relationship. It's not an easy relationship to understand. And I always ask myself, over the next couple of decades, are India and China going to be adversaries? Are they going to be competitors? Or are they going to be partners? With that as a backdrop, let me look at the canvas that I'm going to cover. I will offer you a short historical overview, a contemporary strategic overlay, some very interesting economic and demographic perspectives that actually tell a different tale than what is normally perceived today in terms of India's potential vis-a-vis China. And then I will touch upon some of India's emerging regional concerns as China moves into what till now India considered to be its backyard, and that's South Asia. And I will conclude with some prognostic perspectives of where I see the relationship going ahead from a realist's point of view. Not a liberal, not an idealistic, not an alarmist, not a hawk, but a realist's perspective. Now, I find it very hard to stay away from history because basically I'm a historian. And it's important to look at history from an India-China perspective, because what happens is, I don't know whether many of you have observed that whenever there's stress between India and China, there come a few press releases from Beijing that say that, oh, India and China enjoy this very, very ancient civilizational heritage, and therefore the two civilizations can rise together peacefully without involving the rest of the world. But is that really the case? If you look at history, the Indian and the Chinese civilizations have grown approximately at the same time, but there has been this barrier of the Himalayas in between, which have prevented the kind of interaction that one would expect between two great civilizations growing in contiguous zones. Now, there have been only two major forays into India by Chinese explorers. We had somebody in the 3rd century, 3rd or 4th century, who was Fahin, and then again in the 6th and 7th centuries, Hyun Sang. They were basically scholars in search of the truth, attracted by Buddhism, and then they followed that red line, which conforms to what everybody calls today as the overland Silk Route. They came into India via Central Asia, Afghanistan, what is today Pakistan. The first name that I mentioned came primarily to Nalanda University, but Hyun Sang traveled all over India, went to Ceylon, and then went back to China. And then for the next almost 10 centuries, there was very, very little contact between the Indian and the Chinese civilizations until we had Admiral Zheng He. Admiral Zheng He was a famous Chinese admiral whose path that he traversed in the 15th century is what Chinese aspirations meet today. The maritime Silk Route that President Xi Jinping is so aggressively developing conforms exactly to the adventures of Admiral Zheng He in the 15th century. He made a port of call in Ceylon, and then on the west coast of India in Calicut, and then went on for his in search of spices to Arabia and the west coast on the east coast of Africa. After that, nothing much, until both India and China recovered from what China calls the century of humiliation, and India recovered from colonial rule. And we enter into the 1940s, when India achieved independence in 47 and China became an independent, the People's Republic of China, in 1949. And that was when the interaction between the Indian and the Chinese state increased. There was friction and there was divergence. Now let's have a look as to why that initial divergence between the Indian and the Chinese states emerged in the post-World War II era. You had Mao, who was a revisionist leader. You had Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a liberal democrat, and a fair status quoist in terms of not wanting to shake up colonial tendencies, embracing colonial borders, whereas China wanted to revise everything that had been thrust on them in what they call their century of humiliation. You had Mao, who wanted the restoration of historical legacies, and he wanted China to assume sole leadership of Asia. And Mao's maxim was simple, that in order to make the Chinese state powerful, you followed the maxim of power flows through the barrel of a gun. On the other hand, India emerged as a liberal democracy. It did embark on unification and consolidation of states, but in a different way than the Chinese embarked on. India pursued non-alignment, which did not strike a note with Mao at all. Nehru proposed a joint leadership of Asia with China, which once again Mao disagreed with vehemently. And over a period of time, there emerged tremendous personal friction between Chairman Mao and Jawaharlal Nehru. So you had a personal animosity between Nehru and Mao. You had problems over Tibet, and you had problems over the long 4,000 kilometer boundary, which is now called the line of actual control, that led to conflict. So all of you are aware of what happened in 1962. India suffered a humiliating military defeat, and it's taken India more than 4 decades to recover from that defeat and come out of that cocoon of growing in China's shadow. And that's what has happened over the last couple of decades, in which Indian growth has now come out of a cocoon, and there is now serious competition between India and China on multiple fronts. Okay, so how does India understand China? How does modern India understand modern China? Okay, Indian strategic historians and strategic thinkers do not look at China as purely a result of modern China, as purely a result of Mao's philosophy or Deng's sort of liberalism or the current authoritarian streak from President Xi Jinping. What India believes is that Chinese strategic thought has been extremely flexible. It has absorbed ancient Chinese classical thought, contemporary Maoist discourse, Soviet discourse, and of course the long period of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when there was bonhomie between the Indians, between China and the United States. A lot of US techno-doctrinal discourse has been imbibed by the Chinese in their building of comprehensive national power. Earlier on, Deng advised the Chinese people to wait and watch, build your comprehensive power. Now that's no longer the case. President Xi Jinping demonstrates unshackled confidence, which is a high-risk strategy as far as China is concerned, and is fraught with risk, with a risk of overreach, which is actually showing up now when it comes to looking at the Chinese economy and the manner in which China engages with other nations in the region. Okay, so what are some realities from an Indian perspective? Now, there is absolutely no doubt in our minds in India that China is already a global power. India is a rising power in the same region. Now, if you just imagine the map of the area, you know, I'm quite fond of looking at geography as a significant driver of geostrategic compulsions. Never before in history have two powers, one an established power and the other one a rising power, risen peacefully in the same contiguous geographical zone. And now if you look at this geographical zone, it is not just a continental landmass, but this area of contest extends well into the Indian Ocean and what the United States today likes to call the Indo-Pacific. With such a large zone up for contest, I mean, I think we're in for interesting times as we see India and China attempt to sort of jostle for strategic space and yet not end up in a conflict. That's the challenge of India-China relations in the next couple of decades. Now, for very long, China was really not bothered about India, okay, because the power differential between the two countries was too large. But in recent years, China has been seeing India as a strategic irritant. And India is alarmed by China's attempts to erode India's regional influence, whether it is in places like Nepal, whether it is in Bhutan, whether it is in Myanmar, Bangladesh. I will come up with that a little later. But the good news is both nations are evolved and mature states. Both India and China are evolved and mature states. They are not reckless powers. They are not reckless nuclear states. They are responsible nuclear states. And they understand the importance of limiting stress. There is stress, but both India and China understand that limiting stress along contested frontiers and boundaries is the key to progress in the next couple of decades. Okay, a quick set of statistics to give you an idea as to where the two countries are. In 1960, the differential in terms of GDP and exports between China and India was minimal. It rose slowly. 2000, the asymmetry started building. You look at 2015, you look at the difference in the GDP and the exports. It is phenomenal. I mean to say, the gap is unbridgeable. No longer do Indians talk about catching up with China. Catching up with China is an absolute no-brainer. India cannot catch up with China. So what does India do? So Indian strategy today is not to fall into that trap of trying to run with the Chinese. That's not possible. You look at even the armed forces. In every parameter, the Chinese are running away. Whether it is in the number of sophisticated aircraft, whether it is in the question of defense budget, the asymmetry is extremely stark. But there's some good news for India. If you look at this sort of representation, by 2030, the working age population in India will surpass that of China. So what does that mean? It means demographic dividend. So India stands to have a demographic dividend vis-a-vis China from 2025, 2030 onwards. But the demographic dividend can only be leveraged if there are jobs for this working age population, and that's the biggest challenge that the Indian government is facing today, and that's one of Prime Minister Modi's largest endeavors, the Skill India initiative, which is trying to generate jobs to cater for that huge youth bulge. But there's another statistic which is not very flattering, and that is that by 2030 India would overtake China as the most population nation in the world, and that too can only be leveraged in case you have jobs for that huge youth bulge and disposable income that is going to come up. Another set of statistics, interesting again. This is the latest figure of GDP of the top 5 countries in the world in PPP terms, not in real terms, but in PPP terms. And if you look at it, China has already surpassed the United States as the largest economy with $25 trillion in PPP terms, but India is not too far behind at $10.5 trillion. Now if you look at it in real terms, India's GDP till last year was about $2.5, $2.7 trillion, and China was at $12.5 trillion. But the PPP, in terms of purchasing power parity, the Indian economy is very robust, and that is why in terms of PPP, the Indian economy is now only half the size of that of the Chinese economy. Okay, a point of caution offered by Dr. Arjun Subramaniam, the former chief economic advisor to the government of India and currently a visiting professor at Harvard, and he says very interestingly in a recent article that over the past few decades China's growth has appeared to violate certain fundamental laws of economics, which is the Stynes Law, which holds that if something cannot go on forever it will stop, and yet Chinese debt keeps building up. Sooner or later Chinese exceptionalism will give way to the laws of economics. The world should prepare itself, and the consequences could be severe, unlike anything experienced in history. Now let me just explain this to you. Chinese debt is almost twice the size of its GDP. Indian debt is about 20% of its GDP. Chinese debt is many times more its foreign exchange reserves. The Indian debt is significantly calibrated vis-a-vis its foreign exchange reserves. So that's one positive comparison that one always makes between the Chinese and the Indian economies. But as I mentioned earlier, there is cause for concern, and this cause for concern is absolutely accelerating Chinese investments in South Asia. It's breathtaking to look at the scale of Chinese investments in all these countries, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, and of course Pakistan, through which it is building one of its arteries, which is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, about which I will talk a little bit. And if I don't have the time, I can talk about it even in the question answer session. In comparison, you look at this absolute lagging Indian investment in South Asia. It's almost 1/10. Indian investment in South Asia in its own neighborhood is about 1/10 of what Chinese investment has accelerated in the last decade. And this is again one of the things that concerns Prime Minister Modi, and Prime Minister Modi's and subsequent government, even Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's government had given fresh impetus to the Look East and Act East policy, about which we can speak about later. Just to give you an example, this is a study that was recently carried out by the Gateway institution in Mumbai, which closely tracks Chinese investments in India's neighborhood. And if you look at the kind of Chinese investments in most of India's neighboring countries, it is truly breathtaking and covers the entire span of infrastructure: ports, airports, transport networks, utilities, electricity networks, research and development, and urban infrastructure. Similarly, this is Bangladesh. Of all the countries around India, I think India has the best relations with Bangladesh currently. Indian investments in Bangladesh are excellent. However, they are no match for what the Chinese have already invested in Bangladesh. Once again, every possible sector that sort of controls daily life, that influences daily life, communications, ports, transportation, energy, everything has heavy investments from China. Similarly with Myanmar. Okay? So, the battle for South Asia is truly on. What does India do? Complaining or cribbing about China is not going to be of much help, but then the question we all ask is, will competing or confronting China serve any purpose? No, absolutely not. The power differential between India and China in the economic, technological and military spheres is just too great. India must display strategic patience, honor its commitments to its neighbours in terms of building infrastructure and building capacity, and wait for the right time to reclaim its influence in South Asia. This is two very, very respected geopolitical strategists in India in the Observer Research Foundation who've written in a recent article, and I think it makes sense. It makes sense for India not to jump headlong into any kind of a competitive economic race with China, because there's no question of being able to match up. So then, since I'm speaking at a business school, I thought I will look at the India-China perspective from a geo-economics perspective, from an investment perspective. What is it that people from outside would look in both countries if you wanted to invest there, right? Let's look at China first. Authoritarian, speedy decision making, and therefore upfront a little attractive for investment because things get done quickly. It has a large consumer base, greater disposable income which will start flattening out very soon, which has already started flattening out. But China has an extremely fragile and an opaque financial system that over a period of time starts getting to companies from the West that are used to doing business in a free-flowing manner. We would believe that the current investment philosophy followed by the Chinese state is a predatory investment philosophy, which is averse to business partnership models. Whereas on the other side, you have India, which is a democracy, which has always been known for extremely slow decision making, but in the recent past it's accelerated quite a bit. A very large and growing consumer base, rapidly growing disposable income, a less fragile and more transparent financial system, but like China also afflicted with crony capitalism. The broader investment philosophy in India is non-predatory and is collaborative, and that's why you have so many joint ventures coming in between Indian and Western companies that have done extremely well. And the Indian economy right now is open to diverse investment models. Okay, now I will spend some quick time on something which is actually which is very widely known, and that is the fragile security environment that exists between India and China, particularly on its 4,000-kilometer long border that extends from Ladakh to the east to Arunachal Pradesh. I'm sure an informed audience like this would have followed last year's crisis in Doklam, wherein there was a face-off between Indian and Chinese troops, but which did not lead to a firefight, which itself speaks volumes for the kind of restraint that exists between the two armed forces. This problem is not over as yet, it's just shifted a few kilometers to the east. Now, if you look at, I mean to say, I'm not going to go into the fine print of troop deployments, but the largest body of troops in the world are ranged against one another across 4,000 kilometers of contested boundaries. Okay, whether it is airfields with modern aircraft, or whether it is sophisticated weapons across both sides, or whether it is huge divisions, almost 1 million troops face off against one another across this extremely hostile high altitude wasteland, which many people call is of no use to man or beast, and yet nations have egos because of which these kind of conflicts continue to endure. Okay, many of you must have also heard of this concept of string of pearls, a string of pearls which is merely Chinese realism and Chinese aspirations coming to the forefront. Now for very long, I wouldn't say very long, till very recently, we used to crib in India. I mean to say, we used to ring the alarm bells. Oh, China is putting together a string of pearls around India and threatening India's security. China did that because that suits its, or that furthers its national interest and its aspirations. So for the last few years, India has adopted a more realistic view on this particular issue and said, okay, if China is going to adopt a string of pearls strategy, India has its own strategy of, how would I put it? India has its own strategy of increasing engagement with East and Southeast Asia. And that is why, in response to this increasing Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, India has robust relationships with Myanmar, with Vietnam, with Singapore, with Japan, with Korea, and therefore I will argue that the great game is on. Just as in the 19th century it was a great game between the British colonial empire and the Russian empire, the great game in Asia is on in the 21st century. Okay. Another thing that troubles India a lot is the collusive relationship between China and Pakistan in almost every domain, whether it is the military domain, whether it is the nuclear dimension, or whether it is the direct support from China for the Pakistani strategy of keeping India engaged. Now once again I talked about a great game. You just look at this as a game. It suits Chinese strategic interests for India to devote much of its energy onto its western front, dealing with the insurgency and the proxy war in Kashmir, and thereby sort of diminishing its ability to build up comprehensive national power as it competes with China for strategic space. Yeah, okay. Now this is what I was talking about. This is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is part of China's Belt Road Initiative and runs right through contested territory of Pakistan occupied Kashmir down to the Arabian Sea. Now $62 billion, and I would argue that this is not an investment that the Pakistanis are going to be able to repay the Chinese in time, and therefore the question we investigate today in India is that, is Pakistan gradually becoming a client and a vassal state of China? Okay, as I wrap up my session, let me look at what would you look at India's strategies as it attempts to match the Chinese juggernaut, the Chinese dragon. The look east and act east policy that India has followed over the last 2 decades is a sensible and a sound policy. It just needs to be given further momentum. India has robust strategic partnerships with the United States, with France, with the United Kingdom, Singapore and Vietnam. I will argue that these relationships are only going to get stronger in the years ahead. India has made it a point in the last couple of years to talk about shared interests, shared values, and respect for international law, respect for global commons as being available for everybody. we are not despondent about the boundary issue dragging on for too long. There is hope that India and China will be able to sit across the table in the years ahead and work out a boundary agreement that is just, equitable and fair. But that can only happen when there is tremendous statesmanship from both sides that put aside national egos and do something productive for the greater good of both countries. I don't know whether it will happen soon, but one can only hope. Can we search for common ground? I think when we talk about partnership between India and China, there have been attempts which haven't been very successful, and therefore my prognosis is that any collaborative models between India and China will only offer low dividends, and therefore I call them low-hanging fruit. There are no attractive, fully ripened fruits for both India and China to partake similarly. There are no real regional economic ventures that India and China have embarked on. It makes sense to embark on regional partnerships that have value for both, but it doesn't appear. It hasn't happened. So it does send alarm bells ringing. Okay, some photographs. This is the kind of face-off that takes place on a regular basis across the border. You have these troops facing off against one another. You have no firing, and you have these banners in which you go back and forth. There is unique, uneasy but stable deterrence. There is stress along the line of actual control, huge troop deployments, but not a single shot has been fired in anger between India and China from 1967. That speaks volume for the fact and corroborates what I mentioned earlier, that both are evolved and mature states. And this is what the Indian and the Chinese militaries do regularly across the border. Okay, they meet periodically for stabilizing meetings. They drink each other's liquor, and of course the Chinese liquor is much stronger than the Indian one. Okay. Okay, I think I'll spend a quick few minutes on contemporary Indian military history and my passion for that. Okay, about 3 or 4 years ago I realized that military history is not really an integral part of contemporary Indian historical discourse, and I said that I must try and do something in order to set right that aberration. And that actually was the root for my serious investigation into war and conflict in contemporary India. So my first book was India's Wars, a Military History from 1947 to 1971, and the project I'm currently engaged in is writing the sequel for this book. And that's one of the things, apart from engaging with the faculty and students, one of the things I'm doing here, which my sabbatical here at Northeastern allows me to do. Some quality time researching and writing at some of the best libraries that are here in Boston. Now, the reason why contemporary Indian military history is important is because India is a power in transition. It is willing to use the military as a tool of statecraft without being apologetic, like all great democracies have, whether it's the United States or whether it is France or whether it is Great Britain. For very long the Indians have been very apologetic about the use of force. India has had this notion that there is space in this world for an altruistic and liberal democracy which is different from everything else. But actually that hasn't been the case. India also has had to use force on numerous occasions during its modern history of last 70 to 80 years to preserve democracy, and I'll show you on the next slide. Yeah, if you look at it, these are the number of conflicts that India's armed forces have had to wage since independence, since 1947. And no other democracy in the world other than the United States and Israel have waged so much of conflict in order to protect what is dear to them. And just as democracy and a way of life is dear to the American people, similarly Indian democracy is something which is dear to the Indian people. And if you look at many of these instances, India's armed forces have been asked to step in to plug fissures and cracks that have threatened the fabric of Indian society. And that, to my mind, was reason enough to investigate more deeply into what India's armed forces have really done over the last 7 decades. And that's the fundamental essence of my research that I've been embarked on. Now, the ones highlighted in red are the ones that I have covered in my current book, and the ones in blue and purple are the ones that I am covering in book 2, which is going to be the sequel. Yeah. So apart from the fact that military history is not part of our overall discourse, I actually wanted to, apart from being a fighter pilot and a historian, I am also a storyteller, and that's the role that I enjoy the most today. And so I said, let me tell a story of contemporary Indian military history, and that's the essence of my work. Yep. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for sort of tolerating my banter for the last 40 minutes, and I'm open to questions. Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, your relationship with Pakistan is not good. Pakistan is holding one of your leg. I think your all movements going to be limited. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, it's one has to look at India's relationship with Pakistan through multiple prisms. On the one hand, India's relationship with Pakistan is a throwback to partition of the subcontinent. On the other hand, it is a difference in perception on our fundamental approach towards the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is an intrinsic part of the Indian state but is contested by Pakistan. And the third element, which is actually the most important element of the strategic scenario in South Asia, is that you're absolutely right when you say that Pakistan is an effective proxy for China to keep India engaged and prevent India from fulfilling its potential as a regional power. So which means to say, Pakistan, just as China perceives India to be an irritant, similarly now, with the asymmetry between India and Pakistan so large, India perceives Pakistan to be a spoiler in its quest for uninhibited growth and building of comprehensive national power. So yes, you're absolutely right when you say that Pakistan is keeping us busy, keeping us engaged, and it's not going to disappear for some time. Yes, Chris.
You mentioned a string of pearls in the Indian Ocean. Perhaps you could mention a bit more about India's response to China's presence in the Indian Ocean, either economically, diplomatically, or militarily.
Yeah, okay. You see, the thing is that it's only over the last 5 or 6 years that the PLA Navy has been increasingly making forays into the Indian Ocean. It makes stops in Sri Lankan ports, it makes stops in Pakistani ports, it's got a port coming up in Djibouti, and there is increased Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Now, that by itself is not alarming, but what is alarming is that when a military presence is complemented with extremely vigorous economic assistance to those littoral countries, it then offers potential for the evolution of multiple vassal states in the region, and that is something that India is attempting to sort of counter by building capacity. Now when you look at the difference between the manner in which China engages with countries in South Asia and the manner in which India engages with South Asia, obviously India can't match the Chinese economic muscle, but what India can certainly match the Chinese is for building capacity within societies, and that's something that India is doing very vigorously. For example, India is engaged very intimately with both Sri Lanka and Maldives when it comes to keeping an eye on the trajectory of democracy. India is keeping a very close eye on its relationship with Bangladesh, which is right now at its peak, to ensure that the kind of growth that has taken place in Bangladesh and the kind of democracy that exists in Bangladesh is protected and is nurtured and not sort of inundated by Chinese investment. So I think it's a multi-pronged strategy which is evolving slowly. For example, India's relationship with Myanmar is extremely robust today in spite of what's happening with the Rohingya crisis. There is widespread unease in all these countries about the extent to which Chinese investment may just swallow up regional economies. So in offering contrarian kind of assistance, I think India is doing a fair job in not being literally steamrolled by China in the region, but it's cause for concern.
Strategy. You talked about the relationship, obviously, between China and India. How about the neighbor to the north? Do you think the Russians will play any role in the future geostrategic relationship, or try to play any role?
Oh yes. I mean to say, another hot topic within the global geopolitical environment is the resurgence of Russia. And just the other day we had a talk at Fletcher on India-Russia relations and how India is having a hard time in balancing its decades-long relationship with Russia, which has seen significant strain over the last couple of years, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, its growing relationship with the United States, and how Russia once again wants to play an important role in the region, particularly in Afghanistan. So Russia is making a genuine attempt to sort of re-engage with the region. Russian relations with China are on the mend. Russian relationship with Pakistan is improving. Russia has been sort of obliquely indicating to India that, look, if you cozy up to the United States, we have hedging options in Asia. So Russia is playing its cards extremely carefully in Central Asia, which is why if you're following the news, the Russians and the Russians are once again trying to play a very important role in stability in Afghanistan by getting the Taliban into the discussion. So yes, we would need to watch Russia very closely, because Russia is not going anywhere. Russia is very much positioned in Central Asia and in that part of the world to play an important role in the years ahead. I wouldn't discount the role of Russia even in Asia, just as you guys don't discount the role of Russia anymore in Europe.
So you didn't really discuss about U.S. role, whether U.S. will, if it can, allow China to control the whole region.
Just repeat the question.
Yeah. Okay. The question is that why didn't I talk about the U.S. in my presentation? Because I knew it would come up in the question-answer session. Okay. Now, the U.S. is an extremely significant element of the current India-China equation. Now, for the last decade or so, the Indo-US strategic partnership has been growing in leaps and bounds. It's extremely robust in every segment, and today the Indian military exercises with the US military more than the US exercises with any of its NATO allies or other allies, and this is one relationship that the Chinese are extremely worried about, and they would pull out all cards from the pack to ensure that the Indo-US strategic partnership faces roadblocks from time to time. And the Indo-US strategic partnership has one problem, and that problem I call is that of a tyranny of distance. Nothing can bridge this tyranny of distance between the two countries, in spite of being one the oldest democracy and the other one the most populous democracy. You have China, which is just to the north of India. China sits on our doorstep, and therefore, irrespective of the strength of the Indo-US strategic relationship, India cannot afford to antagonize China every time, all the time. So the challenge for India is to hedge its bets currently, how best it can develop a robust relationship with the US, how best the Indo-US partnership can sort of balance the Chinese in the region. It's a tough call, but yes, the US is a significant player, and the US is extremely keen to accelerate the strategic relationship with India. But India, like I mentioned to you, India has its concerns. India has its problems in the region, and therefore India can't accelerate the relationship at the pace at which the United States wants. And that's why I call, that's why I call the current Indian strategic engagement as a policy of hengagement, H-E-N-G, okay, which is a combination of hedging and engaging. That's what we need to do. Yes.
India looking to the west, but what about India looking towards Japan and South Korea? Ever since North Korea has been on the rise, it's been a concern for Seoul and Tokyo as well. So do you think that there will be deepening relationships now? Already there are projects between India and Japan.
Oh yes.
Bullet trains,
yeah,
and all these things. So do you think that's going to expand, and Japan and South Korea could be a check on the Pacific region?
Oh yes. The India-Japan strategic relationship is the next most robust strategic relationship that India enjoys after the United States, and that relationship irritates the Chinese no end. Okay, it's not just the bullet train. Indo-Japanese economic cooperation runs long and deep. The current prime ministers of India and Japan are personally extremely close. Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi enjoy an excellent relationship. India carries out extensive naval exercises with the Japanese Navy. The level of Indian scholars who engage with Japan are increasing by the day. So the Indo-Japanese strategic relationship is an extremely strong one. South Korea is a major economic partner of India, not only in the consumer goods, or not only in the automobile sector, but also in the defense industry space. Korean shipyards service the Indian Navy tremendously. India procures ships from Korea. So yes, the so if you recollect, I did mention in my presentation that India's Act East policy is one of our strategies to counter China's aggressive entry into South Asia. So whether it's Vietnam, whether it is Malaysia, whether it is Singapore, I mean, so you won't imagine that small little country like Singapore has the most robust defense relationship with India. The Singapore Air Force uses air bases in India to train. The Singapore Navy and the Indian Navy exercise extensively in the waters of Singapore and in the region. Yeah. Yes.
So in the recent past, we have seen that United States and Pakistan relationship is going down,
Yeah.
and China's presence is increasing in Pakistan. So what do you see in the future, these relationships going forward?
I see the China-Pakistan relationship becoming stronger and stronger day by day. I see the United States being extremely skeptical and wary about engaging with Pakistan as long as the Pakistani state continues to be the epicenter of jihadi terrorism. And yes, like I mentioned to you, I think it's a rather critical view, but it is also my critical view is shared by many, not only Indians, that Pakistan is well on the road to becoming a vassal or a client state of China. Yes.
This may be an unfair question because I'm asking you as a historian to look into
Yes.
the future. But when you think about worst case scenarios of given a nuclear Pakistan and India, etc., what could that worst case military scenario be for the subcontinent, and what do you think the outcome of that would be?
Okay. Worst case, okay. In the case of an India-China, when one looks at the India-China equation, the worst case scenario that can happen is a limited high intensity conflict along the mountainous regime. I don't think the Chinese Navy and the Indian Navy will face off on the seas because of the sheer risk of having a conflict in the Indo-Pacific or the Indian Ocean, because of the commercial interests and because of the economic importance of the region to both India and China. So if at all there is going to be any kind of a flare up between India and China, it is going to be restricted to those desolate high altitude battlefields, short high intensity limited conflicts of the kinds that India fought at Kargil. Now Pakistan is a different game altogether. With Pakistan, I would not say that there are multiple scenarios that are possible. I would say that there are just a couple of scenarios. One scenario is that you have another Mumbai kind of an attack, and that Mumbai kind of an attack is responded to by India with a little more muscle in terms of carrying out cross-border strikes. But what would those targets be? You never know. You don't know. That's the problem of these kind of responses. The other kind of a scenario that one can expect or one can have is that after the impact of Kargil is over a few years, maybe some other ambitious Pakistani general could plan something else, thinking that they could take India by surprise, and then there would be another robust Indian response. Now, if you are suggesting something in the nuclear domain, I wouldn't be so alarmed about a nuclear flashpoint in South Asia. You see, that's one thing that I argue whenever I speak with American scholars here. There is a very dark picture painted over here in the United States about the nuclear instability in South Asia. But the reality on ground is a little different. Yes, India and China are stable nuclear states. India and Pakistan are declared nuclear weapon powers, but there is deterrence and there is some amount of balance that exists. So unless you have a dirty bomb falling into the hands of jihadis who decide to use it indiscriminately, otherwise even as far as the nuclear dimension is concerned, I think there is fair amount of stability that exists between India and Pakistan. Yes.
I love it, and one of my favorite slides is there. It's a GDP comparison, and I wanted to ask a question about the budgets that China and India can dedicate to their military. You know, are they also 4-to-1 or?
Oh, it's more than 4-to-1. Yeah, you see, the thing is, the question is that do India and China's defense budgets also reflect this asymmetry that exists in the overall economies? And the answer is yes. The Chinese defense budget is officially more than 4 times that of India's defense budget, but everyone knows that the official Chinese defense budget is not what is real Chinese defense budget. There are a lot of hidden allocations within the Chinese defense establishment that doesn't get reflected in budgeting, and therefore I would argue that the Chinese defense spending is more than 5 times that of India, and that's been one of India's biggest problem areas in the last decade. For India to match its national security requirements, I think a reasonable figure is approximately 3% of GDP that needs to be allocated for defense. But over the last decade or so, India has rarely crossed 2% of GDP, and which is why you see a number of gaps that have emerged in India's defense preparedness, which need to be addressed sooner than later. Yes, that gentleman at the back. I think you've been raising your hand the maximum. Yeah.
The environmental concerns that are surrounding both China and India, as we know that New Delhi and Beijing both are some of the most polluted cities in the world today.
Yeah.
So one would expect that the countries should collaborate and work together on that front. But we see new strategies like China government legalizing the ban, lifting the ban from tiger bone and rhino horns being lifted. So what do you think? Is this like a strategic move that China, is the environmental concern being overlooked by the two countries at the moment?
Actually, the answer is yes. You see, the question is that the question is, at one point in time one heard of India and China collaborating on climate change, which is one of the low-hanging fruit. But you're absolutely right when you observe that in the recent past that hasn't taken place. So I think both I think both India and China are going through the predictable pangs of developing economies when they grapple with balancing economic growth and protecting the environment and understanding the dangers of environmental degradation that can cause long-term effects, which the West is now realizing. Okay, so I think it's a process of evolution, and I think both India and China are not yet on the road to sort of accepting, understanding, and evolving strategies to limit the negative impact of environmental degradation and climate change.
India has generally had a policy of non-alignment, and as Mr. Nehru, like right here with Mr. Mao, like he had a policy of non-alignment where we didn't commit to any super bloc. And you coined the word engagement, which I really enjoyed listening to. So do you, as a historian and as a military man yourself, would you have India follow this policy of engagement and like being neutral, or would you rather have India commit to a superpower and build stronger relations on one front and not play their cards safer?
Okay, it's a difficult question, very difficult question to answer, and for me to sort of commit. Considering that I've been part of the establishment for 35 years, but let me look at it conceptually. Okay, you can balance and hedge only up to a particular point, and I think India is reaching that point very soon when it has to take a firm decision. It has to take a call, and it's that call that India has been debating and avoiding for the last 50 years in the best traditions of this, in the best traditions of the Hindu philosophers of debating, contemplating, thinking, waiting, watching. I think that time will soon come when you have to take a call as to who your friends are and who do you need to align with in order to ensure the development of comprehensive national power. Now you look at the ambiguity. You see, both Prime Minister Vajpayee and both Prime Minister Modi, in their speeches when they came here to Washington, in both their speeches they talked about the United States as an ally, but the moment that gets translated into policy, India says no, we can. The India is too large and strong a state to be anybody's ally. We are partners. We will be partners, and that's India's stand. Now I don't fault that stand, but I think as a young person, you are well within your rights to demand a little more clarity. And when is India going to sort of lay out its cards on the table? But that's ambiguity, and ambiguity is a potent tool of statecraft. Keep adversaries guessing, keep potential partners guessing, but you can keep them guessing only for so long and not anymore. Yeah. Yes.
So my question is with India's and China's neighboring countries, right? Sri Lanka, Burma, Bhutan. So they already have enough investments, a lot of investments from China, but they also understand the growing role of India and their strategic partnerships in the West as well as in the East with Japan and so forth. And given this predatory kind of an investment style of China versus a more collaborative style of India, will we see less and less investments from Chinese or Indian neighboring countries having lesser and lesser investments from China and more investments from India going forward?
I don't know. You know, most of these countries where China is investing have experienced growth, and when you experience growth, you don't want to put a halt to that growth, and you will abandon caution to some extent when investment comes in, and that's exactly what countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh and Myanmar are facing. And what happens is that by the time you realize it's too late, exactly like what happened in Sri Lanka. The Hambantota port, Sri Lanka was unable to service the debt imposed on it by China, and then China took over the port, and now it's going to handle that port for the next 4 or 5 decades in lieu of monies due from Sri Lanka. Similar thing is going to happen in Pakistan also. The International Monetary Fund is already worried that part of its bailout package that is on the pipeline to be given to Pakistan will be used to service its debt coming from the BRI. Now, how they are going to negotiate that is going to be something interesting. So it's a big challenge, and there's something known as an emerging economies greed. Emerging economies have huge appetites, and when somebody like China can whet that appetite, they'll say keep it rolling, keep it coming, we'll see.
You talked about various scenarios between India and China. Is it fair to say that India today has an effective deterrence, forget about winning a war?
Oh yes.
Can you amplify what is the nature of that deterrence?
No, that's a very interesting question. You see, the one thing that China is particularly careful about is about India's military capability. Despite the asymmetry, the Indian military has been constantly engaged in operations for the last 70 years. The Chinese military, on the other hand, may have the best gizmos, but they are not but I will argue that they don't have adequate operational experience. Now, the second issue which Chinese are worried about is that in a short and sharp conflict that can take place between India and China, what is in question is the ability of China to take attrition. The Indian army particularly is constantly engaged in Kashmir and in other insurgencies. It is operationally tuned. The Chinese armed forces are extremely powerful, but are they operationally tuned enough to sort of steamroll over the Indian military? The answer is no. So that is one deterrence. And the second deterrence, of course, is both China and India know that the other possesses nuclear weapons that have adequate reach to target all population centers and all major areas in each other's country. I mean to say, the latest Indian missile, which is the Agni 5, has a range of over 5,000 kilometers that can effectively sort of deter any kind of Chinese nuclear adventurism. So there is, that's what I call, there is deterrence in place, and that deterrence to a large extent is because of Indian military capability, even though there is significant asymmetry.
I'm afraid our time is up. Please join me in thanking Arjun for a